Hello, welcome back. So, it's time for our next installment of Flora and Ulysses, and the Kitty Club is here with me today because they really like this book. So yesterday, or whenever you watched the last video, we were reading about Flora in Dr. Measham's apartment. Dr. Measham's an interesting character, a little mysterious. She's from some place called Blundermeeson. We don't know where this is. But she's telling Flora about how much her father loves her. And she talks about things like how in Blundermeeson they always expected something good to happen. And then Flora's father arrives at the door. And I'll start at the very end of that chapter. There was a knock at the door. "See," said Dr. Measham, "this will be your father, Mr. George Buckman." Flora stood and went to the door and opened it. It was her father, and he was smiling again. Still, which did seem kind of miraculous. "Hi, Pop," she said. "You see," said Dr. Measham, "he smiles." Flora's father's smile got bigger. He took off his hat. He bowed. "George Buckman," he said. "How do you do?" Flora couldn't help it. She smiled too. She was still smiling when a noise that sounded like the end of the world echoed through the hallway of the Blixen Arms. 1 minute, her father was standing there with his hat in his hands, smiling, and the next minute, Mr. Claus the cat one came out of nowhere and landed right on top of George Buckman's unprotected head. And here is the comic of that happening. So, fortunately, a superhero was present. And there's Ulysses. And he's thinking, "Sunny side up!" And he lands on top of the cat and lifts the cat over his head and throws the cat down the hallway. And Flora says, "Oh, for the love of Pete." And her father says, "Holy bagoomba." And there's Mr. Claus, kind of dazed at the end of the hallway. And look at Ulysses. Vanquished. And the superhero was inordinately pleased with himself. He felt immensely powerful. He felt like writing a poem. Okay. Chapter 41 is called "I Promise." They were in the car. Flora's father's hands were on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock and 2. Flora was sitting up front with Ulysses' head out the window. They were heading back to Flora's mother's house in spite of Flora's protestations. "We have to go back," said her father. "We have to return at the regular Saturday afternoon time. We have to act normal, natural, unconcerned." Flora wanted to object, but she could read the writing on the wall, or rather she could read the words that hovered above her and her father and the squirrel. "Destiny could no longer be forestalled. The arch nemesis must be faced." "Holy bagoomba," said her father. His right ear was wrapped in a huge amount of gauze. His head looked lopsided. "Holy unanticipated occurrences. A squirrel vanquished a cat." He shook his head. He smiled. "And now it's time for another battle," said Flora. "Everything will be fine," said her father. "So you say," said Flora. It started to rain. Ulysses pulled his head back inside of the car. He looked up at Flora, and the sight of his little whiskered face calmed her somehow. She smiled at him, and the squirrel sighed happily and curled up in her lap. "When I was a girl in Blundermeeson," Dr. Measham had said to Flora when they were all leaving apartment 267, "we wondered always if we would see each other again. Each day was uncertain, so to say goodbye to someone was uncertain too. Would you see them again? Who could say? Blundermeeson was a place of dark secrets, unmarked graves, terrible curses, trolls were everywhere. So we said goodbye to each other the best way we could. We said, I promise to always turn back toward you. I say those words to you now, Florabelle. I promise always to turn back toward you. And now you must say them to me. I promise to always turn back toward you, Flora had said. She whispered the words again now to the squirrel. I promise to always turn back toward you. She put a finger on Ulysses' chest. His tiny heart was beating out a message that felt like, I promise, I promise, I promise. Hearts were the strangest things. Pop, said Flora. Yes, said her father. Can I feel your heart? My heart? Said her father. Okay, sure. And then, for the first time ever, George Buckman took both his hands off the steering wheel while the car was in motion. He opened his arms wide. Flora gently moved Ulysses out of her lap and onto the seat beside her. And then she reached up and across and put her hand on the left side of her father's chest. And she felt it, her father's heart, beating there inside of him. It felt very certain, very strong, and very large, just like Dr. Measham had said, capacious. Thank you, she told him. Sure, he said, you bet. He put his hands back on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock and 2, and the three of them, Flora, her father, and the squirrel, traveled the rest of the way home in a strange and peaceful silence. The only noise was from the windshield wipers. They hummed back and forth, singing a sweet, out-of-tune song. The squirrel slept, and Florabelle Buckman was happy. Okay, chapter 42 is called Foreboding. Her father pulled the car into the driveway and cut the engine. The windshield wipers let out a surprised squeak, then froze in mid-wave. The rain slowed to a trickle. The sun came out from behind a cloud and then disappeared again, and the smell of ketchup melded with butterscotch rose with a gentle persistence from the seats of the car. Here we are, said her father. Yep, said Flora, here we are. 412 Belgrade Avenue. It was the house that Flora had lived in for the whole of her life. But something was different about it. Something had changed. What was it? Ulysses crawled up on her shoulder. She put her hand on him. The house looked sneaky somehow, almost as if it were up to no good. Foreboding. That was the word that popped into Flora's head. The house seemed full of foreboding. Do inanimate objects, couches, chairs, spatulas, etc., absorb the energy of the criminals, the wrongdoers among whom they live? The criminal element had queried in a recent issue. It is, of course, entirely unscientific to assume such a thing, but still, we are forced to admit that in this woeful world there exist objects with an almost palpable energy of menace, spatulas that seem cursed, couches that contain literal and metaphorical stains of the past, houses that seem to perpetually groan and moan for the sins contained in their environs. Can we explain this? No. Do we understand this? We do not. Do we know the criminals exist? We do. We are also terribly, and unfortunately, certain that the criminal element will be forever among us. And the arch nemesis, thought Flora, the arch nemesis will be forever among us too. Ulysses' arch nemesis is in that house right now. Do you remember the darkness of 10,000 hands? Flora said to her father. Yep, said her father. He wields 10,000 hands of anger, greed, and revenge. He is the sworn enemy of Incandesto. He's Incandesto's arch nemesis, said Flora. Right, said her father. I tell you what, the darkness of 10,000 hands better stay away from our squirrel. He honked the horn. Home the warrior, he shouted. Home the cat-conquering superhero squirrel. Ulysses puffed out his chest. Let's go, said Flora. We have to do it. We have to face the arch-nemesis. Right, said her father. Bravely forward. And he honked the horn again. George Buckman seems to be changing a little bit. He just seems more energized, more happy, more confident. Okay, I'm going to read one more chapter. Chapter 43, Treacle. They walked into the house, and the little shepherdess was waiting for them. She was standing where she always stood, the lamb at her feet, the tiny globe above her head, and a look on her face that said, I know something that you don't. Flora's father took off his hat and bowed to the lamp. George Buckman, he said, how do you do? Hello? Flora shouted into the silence of the house. From the kitchen came the sound of laughter. Mom? Said Flora. No one answered. Flora's sense of foreboding deepened, expanded, and then her mother spoke. She said, That's absolutely right, William. William? William? There was only one William that Flora knew. What would he be doing in the kitchen with a known arch-nemesis? And then came the familiar rattle of the typewriter keys being struck, the thwack of the carriage return being hit. Ulysses' grip on her shoulder tightened. He let out a small chirrup of excitement. Her mother laughed again. The laughter was followed by the truly terrifying words, Thank you so much, William. Shh, said Flora to her father, who was standing listening, his hat in his hands and a goofy smile on his face. There was a small round drop of blood on the ear bandage. It looked oddly festive. You stay here, Flora said to him. Ulysses and I will go and check this out. Right, right, said her father. You bet. I'll stay here. He put his hat on his head. He nodded. Flora, superhero on her shoulder, walked quietly, stealthily through the living room and into the dining room and stood before the closed kitchen door. She held herself very still. She made herself into a giant ear. She was getting extremely good at making herself into a giant ear. Flora listened, and she could feel Ulysses, his body tense and expectant, listening too. Her mother spoke. She said, Yes, it will go on like this. Federico, I have dreamed of you for eons. No, said another voice, a high, thin, and extremely annoying voice. I've dreamed of you for all eternity. Ooh, said Flora's mother, for all eternity. That's good. More poetic. Ulysses shifted his position on Flora's shoulder. He nodded. Yes, exactly, said William Spiver. More poetic. Eon sounds too geological. There's nothing romantic about geology, I assure you. Okay, said Flora's mother. Right. What's next, William? Actually, said William Spiver, if you don't mind, I would prefer to be called William Spiver. Of course, said Flora's mother. I'm sorry. What's next, William Spiver? Let me see, said William Spiver. I suppose Federico would say, And I have dreamed of you, Angelique, my darling. I must tell you, they were dreams so vivid and beautiful that I am loath to wake to reality. Ooh, that's good. Hold on a sec. The typewriter keys came to a clacking life. The carriage return dinged. Do you think that's good? Flora whispered to Ulysses. Do you think that's good writing? Ulysses shook his head. His whisker brushed against her cheek. I don't think so either, she said. Actually, she thought it was terrible. It was sickly sweet nonsense. There was a word for that. What was it? Treacle. That was it. Having located the correct word, Flora felt a sudden need to say the word aloud, and so she did. She pushed open the kitchen door. She stepped forward. Treacle, she shouted. Flora? Said her mother. Treacle? Said William Spiver. Yes, said Flora. She was pleased that with one simple word she had answered two very important questions. Yes, she was Flora, and yes, it was treacle. Okay, we'll stop there for now. Thanks for watching. Keep tuning in,